annual compliance reports. We're all, I think, used to political leaders at home making promises, as in Her Majesty's Queen's speech in the United Kingdom just a few hours ago, I believe, but then not keeping their promises 100% until the next one comes along. Do they do any better when they come together to make these promises, commitments at G7 summits? We watch, we measure, we monitor, and you'll be hearing some of the results of what we found today. If we get underway now, Denisse, on the second part of a presentation, which will be led off by my co-author and colleague, Brittaney Warren.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Denisse, for the invitation to be here. I'm happy to be here with everyone. My name is Brittaney. I'm the Director of Policy Analysis with the G7 Research Group. So today I'm going to start my presentation with a brief introduction, followed by an overview of the G7 Research Group's data that tracks the G7's climate change performance across three key indicators that I'll be focusing on, including deliberations, which are measured as the portion of the leaders' communique dedicated to climate change, their commitments and their compliance with those commitments. And then I'll end with a couple of key achievements made at recent G7 summits before passing the floor back to John, who will discuss our research findings on how the G7 can continue to improve its compliance. So the G7 is a key actor in global climate change governance. Its members collectively account for about 3/4 of all global greenhouse gas emissions. It has governed climate change since 1979, so it's been an early mover in the climate change space. Since then, the G7's performance on climate change has improved, showing a rising trend over time. This assessment is based off of the three quantitative indicators I just mentioned, which compare the G7's present performance with its performance against its own past summits. So based on this, again, the data do show a rising trend, which provides room for optimism for continued and stronger climate action going forward. However, this should be understood within the context of the climate crisis. The G7's climate governance has often been crowded out by other urgent global crises, including terrorism, declining democracy, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. But we know that the climate crisis does not stop for any other event and in fact exacerbates existing problems, not least health ones. So the G7 does need to do much more to step up its ambition. So overall, the G7 has dedicated 5% of its public deliberations or communiques to climate change. And from these, it's made 319 politically binding commitments. Its governance spans 4 distinct phases. The first phase is from 1979 to 1989. And here the G7 dedicated an average of 1% of its communiques per summit to climate change, and it made a total of 5 climate commitments. The second phase from 1990 to 2004 averaged 2% per summit and had a total of 42 commitments. The third phase from the 2005 UK Gleneagles Summit until 2014 averaged 12% per summit and made a high of 221 commitments. The fourth and final phase from 2015 until 2021 averaged 13%, but here we see a drop in the number of total commitments made to 51, with no climate commitments made for 2 years in a row in 2019 and 2020. These commitments only matter, however, if the G7 is actually complying with them when they go home after the summit ends. The G7 Research Group has assessed 92 of the G7's climate commitments, and we found that compliance averages 73%, which is about a B- grade. This is slightly lower as well than the G7's compliance average of 76% across all subject areas. Looking at the G7's compliance by phase, in the first phase, compliance averaged a low 54%. This rose to 73% compliance in the second phase. It rose slightly to 75% in the third phase, and then it rose again to 80% in the fourth phase. And looking at the G7's compliance by member, the three highest climate compliers are the European Union with 91%, followed by the UK with 83% and Germany with 82%. Canada, Japan, France, and the US all fall in the 70% range, and Italy has the lowest compliance with just 55%. And lastly, I will highlight two key achievements of the some recent G7 summits. So the first is from the 2015 ELMAL summit. Here, the G7 made a specific commitment with targets to ensure that 400 million people in vulnerable regions would have access to climate insurance by 2020. So this commitment is the closest that the G7 has come to responding to least developed countries' calls for compensation for loss and damage due to developed countries' historic emissions and the climate-fueled storms and sea level rise that these emissions cause and that disproportionately impact small island developing states and other small nations that are least responsible for the climate crisis. So this commitment does fall short of what LDCs have called for, but it did bring a new commitment to the G7 agenda. The second highlight is from the 2016 Ise-Shima Summit. So here the G7 committed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. The G7 members had already committed to phase out these subsidies through the G20 since 2009. And the qualifying language of inefficient in this commitment raises questions about what the individual G7 members would actually consider a fossil fuel subsidy. But the G7 Ise-Shima Summit was the first time that a clear deadline of 2025 was set. So to recap, the G7's climate governance has followed a rising trend across 4 phases of governance since 1979 and measured against 3 key quantitative indicators, with the exception of its climate commitments that dropped in the 4th phase when former US President Donald Trump arrived in 2017. The G7 has also made some important contributions for climate action in recent years. However, its ambition is still lagging behind what is actually needed to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis, and much is missing from its agenda, from shifting subsidies away from industrial agriculture and, importantly, for protecting nature and biodiversity, endorsing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and more. So now I'll pass the floor back to John, who will discuss how the G7 can continue improving its compliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittaney. As Brittaney has reminded us, G7 members comply with their leaders' climate change commitments at a level of only 73%. This must be fixed now, given the climate crisis we confront. So what can G7 leaders do to improve compliance when they make new climate change commitments at Cornwall 1 month from now? Now, with the usual caveats that correlation is not causation, and that we have evidence which is all too sparse, let me boldly answer 15 things the available evidence suggests. So for each summit, they should, 1, hold pre-summit environment ministers meetings. When they do, and they've done that about 20 times so far, compliance averaged 73%. The 16 years they didn't, it averaged only 69%. So it's good news that environment ministers will meet in 9 days on May 20th this year. 2, create official level environment bodies. G7 summit climate commitments were 33% more likely to have higher compliance in the same year an official level environment body was formed, and 20% more likely to have higher compliance the year after it was. 3, increase G20, that's the group of 20, climate commitments and compliance. G20 compliance with its own climate commitments coincides well with G7 members' compliance with theirs. For each 10% increase in G20 compliance, G7 compliance is 9% more likely to rise that year. So this year, it's good news that the hosts of the G7 and G20 are both G7 members and have been coordinating their summits very closely since the start. 4, Mount UN climate summits. G7 compliance is higher in the years when a UN climate summit was held. Now this year, the leaders of the UK hosting the G7 summit and of Italy hosting the G21 also co-chair the UN climate summit in Glasgow on November 1st to 12th. But to bolster this good news, they should not delay COP26 for yet another year. They should also ask the UN to have COP summits every year and not force the world to wait once every 5 or 6 years. And they should hold more special climate summits, like the one Emmanuel Macron pioneered in 2017 and Joe Biden expanded on Earth Day 3 weeks ago. 5, they should make more climate conclusions. G7 summits with the highest compliance, averaging 84%, had more words on climate change in their communiques than those with lower compliance of only 59%. 6, make more climate commitments. The high complying summits averaged 12 commitments per summit on climate change, of course, while the low complying ones had only 6. 7, follow the European Union. The 5 members of the European Union in the G7, including the United Kingdom historically, averaged compliance of 76%, and that's above the overall average of 73%. Now, for each individual commitment, and we have assessed 93, G7 leaders should 8, use highly binding language. We will, we shall, we commit to. Commitments using that highly binding language averaged compliance of 75%. Those using low binding language, we reaffirm, we iterate, we will continue to, averaged only 72%. 9, they should build on past summits. Compliance came in at 78%, with commitments referencing a past G7 summit. 10, they should use the core international organization. Commitments referring to the UNFCCC, its COPs, or the Paris Agreement averaged compliance of 77%, again, above the 73% average overall. 11, they should partner with the private sector. Commitments that refer to the private sector average compliance of 77%. And here I would suggest that number 12, they should set a 1-year timetable, because commitments with a multi-year timetable, oh, let's wait for 2 years or so, had compliance of only 72%, a touch below the average. 13, they should connect with economic and energy subjects. The highest compliance came with commitments that referenced the economy, markets, or growth at 85%, natural disasters at 80%, transportation at 78%, energy at 75%, and technology at 74%. 14, they should include Indigenous peoples. Summits that referred to Indigenous peoples in their communique conclusions had 85% compliance, while those that didn't had only 72%. And 15, they should cooperate with cities. Summits that referred to cities in their conclusions had compliance of 76% compared to those that didn't, only 72%. And finally, leaders must find a better way to mobilize money, climate finance, to set targets to go with the timetables, and to involve civil society, regional facilities, and least developed countries. But at the moment, in my mind at least, the evidence is sufficiently suggestive to suggest to the leaders at Cornwall, if they want to improve their compliance, they should try doing these 15 things. So thank you for your attention.
Wonderful, John. Thank you so much for that, and Brittaney as well. Before I move on to our next speaker, I just want to quick heads up that the session is being recorded. Apologies for not mentioning that sooner. I put it in the chat. And if you are not speaking, if you could please put yourself on mute, that would be wonderful. So up next is Julia Kulik, who is going to be speaking on the integral role of gender and its intersect with climate change and human health. And Julia, if you could please introduce yourself before you speak, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Denisse. And hello, everyone. My name is Julia Kulik. I am the Director of Research for the G7 and G20 Research Group. I lead the research group's work on the G7 and the G20's performance on gender equality. Myself and other colleagues on the call also recently conducted a study for the Government of Canada to develop training materials for the effective incorporation of sex and gender considerations in climate change and health adaptation in Canada, the findings of which have informed my remarks. And thanks to John and Brittaney for their assessment of the G20's performance on climate change, which I will attempt to build on. So scientists, stakeholders, and the public largely recognize the intense connection between climate change and human health. For many G7 members, rich industrialized countries, wildfires, flooding, extreme heat, and Arctic thaw are consistently harming the health of their citizens. But the biggest impact is experienced by vulnerable populations in low-income countries, including from heat waves, changes in infectious disease patterns, and undernutrition. The COVID-19 pandemic has shone a spotlight on the disproportionate impact of crises on vulnerable populations and the institutional and systemic inequities that contribute to this. It has ultimately given us a preview of what to expect as the impact of climate change on health becomes more acute. One silver lining is that for those countries that are privileged enough to begin their recovery, they have the opportunity to rebuild their communities with these differentiated risks in mind. The integral role of gender and its intersection with climate change and human health are also now widely recognized. Women and girls are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change, largely due to socially constructed norms that make them poorer and confine them to traditional roles as the natural primary users of and managers of natural resources and as primary caregivers. This is particularly true in the global south, where women make up a large percentage of the agricultural labor force, but is also true in the global north and specifically for Indigenous women who often experience the impact of climate change first and at a more rapid rate. For women in the global south, changing patterns of rainfall, increased drought, and scarce natural resources increase the workload of female farmers as it becomes harder for them to secure household essentials. Consequently, girls are the first to leave school to help manage the workload, thus decreasing school enrollment rates for girls. For women in the global north, like northern Canada, for example, changing animal migration patterns and the loss of biodiversity are increasing food insecurity and the reliance on unhealthy store-bought foods. And the resulting chronic undernutrition leads to higher rates of obesity and non-communicable diseases such as diabetes. Stress and stress-related mental illnesses led by anxiety and depression are some of the most common harms identified in women in Canada, but likely applicable to other parts of the world that experience extreme weather-related events. They include stress and anxiety related to riskier and more precarious travel due to melting ice, limited food availability, lack of access to care, and job-related economic losses. In all parts of the world, similar to in situations of war and military conflict, weather-related crises and disasters also increase rates of gender-based violence, with women and girls most at risk. Because women tend to be poorer, have lower levels of access to financial information and services, and have restricted decision-making ability, they are less able to adapt and respond to climate crises. The existing barriers to women's full economic, political, and social participation limit their ability to make decisions not only at the individual household level, but also within frameworks, international frameworks governing climate change control. Given their unique knowledge and experience, women must be empowered to lead in addressing climate change at the global level. Yet, despite their unique lived experiences and vast knowledge, women do not participate fully in climate change decision-making like expected at COP26. Although the G7 has addressed climate change, gender equality, and health, it has rarely done so by connecting the three issues. The G7 first addressed gender equality at its summit in 1990 and does have a long history of connecting it to health, specifically fighting the spread of HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria in Africa, and protecting maternal, newborn, and child health. The introduction and prioritization of the UN SDGs in the G7 communique encouraged the G7 to make the connection between gender equality and climate change at its summits in 2016 and 2018, but attention has not been consistent or sustained. The G7 research group's research on compliance and the factors which influence compliance indicate that in a gender equality context, compliance improves with a higher degree of specificity within that commitment. So, for example, higher compliance is found with commitments that are explicitly linked to health, rather than those which commit to supporting gender equality and women's empowerment more broadly. So broad strokes do not work. Targeted and effective responses to climate change, like other crises, benefit from an understanding of the many issues associated with vulnerability and adaptive capacity within and across communities. This should recognize nuances within and among affected groups, and those groups whose views are often overlooked. This kind of vulnerability assessment and gender-based analysis would allow the G7 to make more effective commitments and increase their likelihood of implementation. It should not expect that strategies for mitigating the impact of climate change on gender equality in their own countries can be applied to the global south. While women in both geographic regions are vulnerable to the impact of climate change, they are vulnerable for different reasons. The G7 must also continue to prioritize women's economic empowerment and labor force participation, including in green jobs, which will ultimately improve women's adaptive capacity to climate change and other crises in the long term. The participation of women in climate change decision-making must also be prioritized. This will lead to more equitable and effective governance. We have all seen photos of these international meetings, the most recent being the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting, in which all the participants were men. More ambitious targets for gender parity and political participation at all levels are needed. Lastly, the G7 must double down on its previous efforts to prevent gender-based violence. It is a pervasive problem for all G7 countries, including those considered to have a narrower gender gap, like Canada and the UK. It is also, as evidenced most recently by COVID-19, on the rise in situations of crisis and will continue to rise as the climate crisis worsens. Moving forward, the G7 must acknowledge the link between climate change, gender equality, and health in order to lead effectively and successfully. As COVID-19 threatens to dramatically increase the number of women living in poverty, more become increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It is more important than ever to ensure equal access to resources and the equitable participation in decision-making processes, which include the highest level of international climate change negotiations. Thanks, and back to you, Denisse.
That was absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for, I think, educating us and bringing to light kind of the links between climate change and gender, and actually the day-to-day vulnerabilities that, as you said, people from different parts of the world not change, but face. So yes, I look forward to discussing this during the Q&A a little bit more. Moving on to our next speaker, if you could please join me in welcoming Sonja Dobson, who is going to be discussing development and climate change. And Sonja, if you could please introduce yourself a little bit more properly. Thank you.
Thanks, Denisse, and thanks to Julia, Brittaney, and John for all your insights. My name is Sonja Dobson, and I am the lead researcher on development for the G7 Research Group, which I've worked with since 2016. As Denisse mentioned, I'm discussing the connection between development and climate change. Development and climate change are, without a doubt, closely related and reliant on each other to be successful. The roughly 880 million people in the 46 least developed countries are more vulnerable to climate change. The development of these countries can also lead to negative impacts on the environment and the climate. This development has to happen in sustainable and environmentally friendly ways that the world is keeping track of, which is a burden that developed countries did not have to face. Instead, the burden on developed countries is to support sustainable development in developing countries. The story of the relationship between development and climate change within the G7 began under Canada's presidency way back in 1988. When the G7 committed to supporting greater awareness by international financial institutions of the environmental impact of their development programs. A couple years later, under the American presidency in 1990, the G7 recognized the replenishment of the International Development Association as marking the incorporation of environmental concerns into development lending. Over the next decade, the G7 would make several more commitments on integrating environmental concerns into development projects. At the start of the new century, the world agreed to the Millennium Development Goals and had until 2015 to achieve the 8 goals. The 7th of which was to ensure environmental sustainability, with targets of integrating the principles of sustainable development into country policies and programs and reversing the loss of environmental resources, reducing biodiversity loss, having the proportion of the population without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation, and achieving a significant improvement in the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers. These targets demonstrate how environmental sustainability is directly linked to human development. The first G8 development commitment on the Millennium Development Goals was in 2002 under Canada's presidency and part of the G8 Africa Action Plan. In total, the G7 made 24 commitments relating to MDGs from 2002 to 2014. While the world was unable to hit all of the MDG targets, there was considerable progress made. Goal 7 on environmental sustainability led to 98% of ozone-depleting substances, such as chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons, being eliminated, a significant increase in marine and terrestrial protected areas, and 147 countries meeting the drinking water target. Before the UN Sustainable Development Summit in 2015 was the G7 Summit held in Germany, which dedicated an entire section of the communiqué to the post-2015 Agenda for Sustainable Development. G7 leaders underlined their commitment to an ambitious, people-centered, planet-sensitive, and universally applicable post-2015 Agenda for Sustainable Development based on the 3 pillars of the environment, economy, and society. A couple months later, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the 17 new Sustainable Development Goals with their 169 targets based on the MDGs was adopted. The 2030 Agenda and SDGs enshrine the relationship between climate change and development. The recognition that ending poverty and investing in growth around the world had to happen alongside efforts to conserve and preserve our environment was realized within these commitments. In 2019, the G7 published their 4th accountability report on development commitments, and the first one with significant focus on the SDGs. The G7 has published an accountability report every 3 years since 2010 to review their progress on development commitments. The 2019 Bureau Risk Report assessed 48 development commitments, 7 of which earned a score of excellent and 27 earned a score of good, while 10 were either satisfactory or below expectations. 2 of those that were below expectations were on biodiversity and marine litter. There can be no separation of combating climate change and supporting development, as they go hand in hand. The UK has long supported this by hosting the very first meeting of G8 Environment and Development Ministers in 2005, where the focus was on climate change in Africa and illegal logging. That same year, the UK launched the ministerial meeting of the Dialogue on Climate Change, Clean Energy and Sustainable Development, which met every year between 2005 and 2008. Since 2016, every environment ministers meeting discussed the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. Achieving the SDGs and fighting climate change are not cheap. They require substantial financing. In 2009, at COP15, developed countries committed $100 billion a year in climate financing by 2020 to support the needs of developing countries. However, 2020 climate financing is estimated to be only $67 billion, about $8 billion of which came from the UK. The UK has been a leader in international development assistance, one of only a handful of countries meeting the most common official development assistance target of 0.7 of their gross national income. And they've met this every year since 2013. It was even protected under the law in 2015. In 2020, the UK was the third largest donor of official development assistance after the US and Germany. While they met their 0.7% of gross national income target in 2020, in real terms, their contributions dropped by 10% due to the decrease of gross national income. However, at the end of 2020, the UK announced that due to the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent economic crisis, in 2021, only 0.5 of their gross national income will go towards official development assistance. Although the UK is shirking their ODA commitments, they remain a strong voice for climate change and development. At the end of March, the UK hosted a climate and development ministerial, and just last week, the G7 foreign and development ministers met for the first time in person since 2019. They committed to achieving a green, inclusive, and sustainable recovery from COVID-19 aligned with the 2030 Agenda and Paris Agreement, which is badly needed as the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly impacted the progress of the SDGs. Foreign direct investment in developing and transition economies that contribute to the SDGs has plummeted at almost 20% lower than it was in 2015, and international project financing at more than 30% lower. The G7 Cornwall Summit should aim to connect as many commitments as possible to the SDGs and ensure they reference the World Bank, give short one-year timetables, and/or specifically mention a country or region, as those are causes that have led to higher rates of compliance in the past. This year could very well be a critical juncture to achieve the SDGs, with less than a decade to go and progress significantly altered by the pandemic to an extent that is not yet fully apparent. And as the world's advanced economies, the G7 must ramp up its efforts to ensure the sustainable development goals are reached globally. Thank you all for taking your time to attend our event, and I'm thrilled to introduce our next speaker, Denisse, who will educate us on environmental crimes.
Thank you so much, Sonja. And I think, really fair to point out that the links between climate change and development just cannot be stressed enough, as well as the need to actually continue moving forward with this agenda, just because of the impact that it has. So thank you so much for those the insights that can show us the impact of climate change and development. So as Sonja mentioned, my name is Denisse Rudich. I am the director of the G7 and G20 research groups here in London. I'm also a strategic advisor in financial crime prevention and CEO of Rudich Advisory, and CCO and co-founder of Elementary B, which looks to work with the private sector and seeing how we can build ESG initiatives into kind of day-to-day business. So I'm kind of speaking from a little bit of a different perspective today. So I'm going to begin to tell you about how I started prepping for today's today's topic and presentation. I came across a quote from a relatively unknown Irish lyrical artist, which basically means that he's like a rapper without music, named David Jackson, and it resonated. He said, "We are living in a planet where the habits of the young battle habits of the old." And when I think about climate change and the nexus with crime and corruption, to me, it is about harm and devastation that's being created for our children and future generations, not only by bad habits, but also by criminality. And they have one heck of a fight against them and ahead of them. They are and they will continue to pay the price for misdeeds and atrocities to our planet that has been driven by greed and profit. It's not easy tackling the topic of climate change and crime. That said, what I consider to be the original G7 task force, which is now the Global Anti-Money Laundering Standard Setter, the Financial Action Task Force, has been leading the way. It expanded its previous mandates and focus from other crimes such as drug trafficking to illegal wildlife trafficking and also to environmental crimes. And they have been working very closely with the United Nations on this. For those of you who may not know very much about environmental crime, it is the world's third most profitable crime, generating between 110 and 281 billion dollars per year. And this is just an estimate. So the actual true number is probably much, much higher. Not only do these types of crimes accelerate climate change, but they also contribute to the financing of conflict, human rights atrocities and abuses, instability, and as we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, the spread of diseases. There is a grassroots movement to create the international crime of ecocide to be prosecuted alongside other crimes such as crimes against humanity, genocide, and the like at the International Criminal Court. But there are also peripheral crimes that have emerged out of the world's attempts to promote transparency and to link finance to positive outcomes for climate change and also for the environment. Now, corruption, organized crime, and fraud are often both the driver, but also the result of environmental crimes and climate change. And the G7 at Cornwall have a very unique opportunity to focus the world's attention on this issue and to lay the foundations for work to come in the next decade or more, because that's what I like to think of what the G7 does. So I'm here to talk to you after that very long introduction. I'm here to talk to you about what the G7 has done in the area of environmental crimes and also what I hope it will do next. So environmental crimes have been addressed within the G7 framework since 1997. So again, thinking about how long the G7 has been going, it kind of got, it started a little bit later on, where it was first mentioned at an environmental ministers meeting. It was not actually referenced in any leaders' communique, so leader level summits or the communication that comes out of the leaders' summits until the 1998 Birmingham summit. And there have been many gaps in years, normally 1 or 2 years, when there has been absolutely no reference to environmental crimes or any underlying environmental crimes. There was also a 5-year gap between 2013, when it was mentioned at in the leaders' communique at Lochern, and 2018, when it was referenced at an environmental ministers meeting, which again just seems like a long time given what's actually happening in the world. We were only able to identify 8 leader level commitments that reference some form of environmental crime type in G7 summit history, with the last G7 leaders commitment made in Lochern. So it's actually been a long, long time. In essence, this topic has historically been relegated to meetings of environmental ministers, interior ministers, and more recently to meetings of G7 finance ministers and central bank governors, which actually was the first time this year at the meeting that Sonja referenced earlier. And while that's fantastic that there is some kind of form of continuity and it is being spoken at ministerial level, it has not garnered the attention that it deserves, and it needs political will for any of the initiatives in this area to actually be driven forward. Nevertheless, what have the leaders committed to in this space, and what are the areas that they focused on? So they have talked about illegal trafficking. Not in 1998 in Birmingham, they talked about the illegal trade in ozone depletion substances, so greenhouse emissions, hazardous waste, and also protected species. So again, recognizing the need to fight this type of trafficking. They've also addressed the topics of illegal logging and illegal trade in waste. And actually Japan has been one of the leaders in this space. So in 2000 in Okinawa, the Okinawa Summit, there was a very high level commitment made to illegal logging. In 2008 at and I apologize for anybody who's Japanese out there, Hokkaido Toyoto Summit, hosted by Japan, there were actually a number of groundbreaking initiatives on illegal logging, but also the illegal trade in waste, including preventing the transboundary movement of reusable, recyclable materials and e-waste. And there was a plethora of documentation that was issued during the ministerials held that year. The G7 have also maybe spent a little bit more time focusing on the exploitation of natural resources and minerals. So again, that links to development. Beginning in 2005 in Glen Eagles, again, they made the link between natural resources and violent conflict in Africa, committing to act with the United Nations and other fora to combat the role played by conflict resources. So we're looking at oil, diamonds, timber, and other scarce natural resources. At 2007 Highlingham Dam Summit, the G7 agreed to support the African Union to halt the illegal exploitation of natural resources. 2009, so again, you're seeing like a 2-year hop between summits. At L'Aquila, the G7 committed to supporting the implementation of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which actually has been a fantastic initiative, and it does go a bit of a ways towards reducing corruption, but also in reducing conflict and violence fueled by natural resources. Although again, some of the reporting might need to be finessed. 2010 at Muskoka, leaders indicated support for the Kimberley process. So again, that was to tackle the prevalence of blood diamonds on the market. And at 2013 Lahern, they kind of shifted a little bit, where the G7 committed to using open data to gain a greater understanding on the demand and the supply side of natural resources to combat corruption. So that's the leaders level, what they have committed to. At the ministerial level, in terms of areas that they've involved that are in addition to what I've just spoken about that they have looked at. In very early on, they did, the G7 environmental ministers linked environmental crime to international organized crime. So actually systematic, organized, and global. And they tasked the Lyon group of experts in organized crime to follow this more closely. In 1998, ministers recognized the need to guard against fraud in carbon emissions trading, which unfortunately there hasn't been any other references to that. And then there was also in 2018, it wasn't until 2018 that illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing was a topic that made, some sort of an appearance and in a ministerial meeting. Now, in April 2019, the Interior Ministers, G7 Interior Ministers had a meeting where they made numerous innovative commitments to fight environmental crimes. And so what exactly did they do and what did they pledge to do? First, they formally defined environmental crimes. And I could read out the definition, but I'm also happy to send you the link to the definition if you want to, if you put that on chat, I'm happy to follow up on that. They recognized the negative impact on all countries. So the negative impact that environmental crimes have everywhere, source, transit, and destination countries. And if you're living in the world, your country is going to be one of those three. And also the threat to international security. And this was pre-COVID. They made numerous commitments around the need to implement proportionate and dissuasive criminal sanction against perpetrators. But most interesting, somebody like me, was the commitment to make civil compensation and also to introduce habitat restoration in damaged areas and for victims. They made a commitment to criminalize illegal wildlife trade, which again was a huge commitment at that time because it hasn't been done, and some countries haven't actually criminalized that just yet. They linked, basically they tasked law enforcement agencies to make use of financial investigation techniques when investigating environmental crimes. And again, given the supply and demand side and the profit generated from financial or from economic crimes, this is a really key initiative. They encourage the development of multi-stakeholder national entities to tackle environmental crimes. They also, talked about establishing pilot projects and national asset recovery. So again, linking asset recovery to environmental crimes, first time that was ever done, and other measures to combat more effectively the financing, but also the laundering of proceeds generated by environmental crimes. They talked about the need to better understand the use of technology, such as the darknet and virtual technologies, to traffic the proceeds of environmental crimes. And they did task the Lyon group to monitor the implementation of these commitments. So again, a lot of fantastic initiatives made at that particular Interior Ministers meeting. But somehow, and very disappointedly, this this actually did not make it to the G7 leaders' final communique at the Biarritz summit. And again, I can kind of muse to the reasons why and the makeup of the G7 at that time. So definitely worth for any policymakers out there re-upping or looking at this at that meeting or the Interior Ministers meeting at that time. More recently, at the G7 Finance Ministers meeting in April 2021, or just last month, a number of climate-specific commitments were made, and this is where I begin to make some recommendations with regards to those commitments. So, finance ministers made a commitment to net zero, so a net zero economy, and I think it's worth maybe knowing that for that to happen, there's going to be a shift towards, electrical cars and electricity and energy, that kind of energy, which means that there's a large dependency on cobalt. Many of you may or may not know that cobalt is largely mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there is a need to put in place safeguards to ensure that this kind of mining just basically does not lead to conflict and violence in what already is a fragile state. And we know that from history, mining in the DRC has been linked to gender-based violence, gross human rights abuses, and other atrocities. So that's kind of one, signpost there. They also pledged to raise climate finance ambition to support the 100 billion target, as Sonja mentioned. And again, it could be directly through OAD, but there has also been a rise in green finance. And there's also been kind of, the link to, new financial products such as carbon emission trading and innovative products such as the recently launched Rhino bond. So these products are actually highly susceptible to fraud, which again, I can talk about a 2016 multi-billion French carbon trading case that was basically involved fraud and organized criminal networks and offshore entities and the like. But I think when developing new finance products that kind of had positive outcomes for the environment, it's also worth making sure that these products are subject to a proper risk assessment to identify how they can be abused by criminals or used to finance crime, and to ensure that controls are put in place to protect consumers who are buying these products and also to prevent them from being defrauded, but also to promote market integrity. The ministers also pledged to improve climate-related financial disclosures through sustainability-related financial reporting standards. And I think just worth highlighting that there is a need to be aware of greenwashing and fraudulent reporting, particularly when this reporting is being used to apply for government grants and subsidies. So again, that kind of contributes to the cycle of laundering. And they further made a commitment to improved international transparency and beneficial ownership to tackle illicit finance from illegal wildlife trade. So I think that G7 leaders should just endorse this ongoing work in this area. Other areas that the G7 could explore is supporting the development of the international crime of ecocide. Again, this is, climate change, and it is, I've already talked about the existential threat, but there is ongoing work, and countries such as France have actually been exploring the creation of this as a crime. Also exploring how the cycle of environmental crime feeds climate change, which feeds financial crime, and how there's just kind of this cycle that's ongoing. As a financial crime prevention professional, I can see that the tools that are used to fight financial crime also promote transparency and accountability through enhanced due diligence, through understanding source and destination of funds and financial flows, capital and assets, and the continuous monitoring of relationships and transactions. So I think it's worth exploring how the intelligence that's gathered as part of these processes can actually be used not only to support ESG initiatives, but also lead to better outcomes for humanity, perhaps. And I think definitely given the lack of connectivity between the data that's available between climate change and other types of crime, I think the possibility of further exploring this would be a great G7 initiative. So I have spoken for longer than the time that I was given. Maybe I took my prerogative as the chair of this event to do so. But now I'm going to hand it over to the amazing Ella Kokotsis, who's going to speak to us about how the G7 summit can set the stage for COP26 in Glasgow. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Denisse, for not only moderating today's session, but for your lovely introduction and for your comments as well. I know as moderator, you don't get thanked accordingly for your comments, which I thought were absolutely brilliant. And I'd love to talk to you more offline about some of your findings. It's wonderful for me to be here today to see a number of my fellow panelists, albeit virtually. I do miss seeing everyone in person, hoping to resume to some level of normalcy soon where we can resume our meetings at our live summit events. Thanks to my colleagues also at the LSE for their invitation to speak on today's panel. I'm Ella Kokotsis, the Director of Accountability at the G7 and G20 research groups. I've been involved with John, Madeline, and a team of others since 1994 and have participated in most G7 summits over the past 25 years. Not to give away my age or anything, but it's been a while. And of course, worked alongside Sir Nicholas for many of those years. I've had the absolute privilege of doing so. And a quick plug before I forget, my co-authors, John and Brittaney, and I are in the process of finalizing our book on G7, G20, and UN climate governance. And we're hoping for publication ahead of this year's G20 summit. So please stay tuned. More to follow on that from Madeline, I'm sure, in the coming months. Now, I've been asked to talk today about how the G7 can set the stage for this November's UN COP meeting in Glasgow. We know that Boris Johnson last year in September at the United Nations General Assembly announced that his country would lead climate action this year through both its G7 presidency and its hosting of COP26 in Scotland. And I do think that the UK is very well poised to use this opportunity to showcase its global leadership. Now, some have cautioned that there could be friction at the G7 on the climate agenda between Johnson, Biden, and Prime Minister Modi of India, who's been invited as a guest at the G7, who see the global recovery and COVID-19 eclipsing everything else on the G7's agenda. But I personally don't suspect that Johnson will allow climate change to become another victim of the pandemic. The Brits over the last few months have reiterated time and again that the global community has to apply the same level of urgency to fighting climate change that it used to fight COVID-19. And I think it will, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But before I do, we recall that COP26 was canceled last year in Glasgow, where the conference venue was actually temporarily converted into a COVID-19 field hospital. Now, COP delegates at that time did consider, but they later rejected, an online meeting by arguing that these highly complex climate negotiations, which often involve over 20,000 global delegates, could simply not be conducted using virtual meeting technologies. So with the extra year to prepare, Boris Johnson has had a chance to now reset the tone. The new date effectively allowed the UK, along with its Italian partners, to harness their G7 and their G20 presidencies in driving climate ambition ahead of COP26. Currently, there's an expectation that more than 190 countries, world leaders, and their delegations will arrive in Scotland in November. And if this event does happen in person, it will be the largest international political gathering that the UK has ever hosted. So, how easy is it going to be for Boris Johnson to stage two very high-profile global events in 1 year? Will Johnson use the G7 to focus on COVID and the global economic recovery and leave the tough choices on climate change to the UN? Or will Johnson use the G7 to produce a stepping stone towards Glasgow? Well, I argue the latter, and here's why. I think this year's G7 will no doubt be strengthened by the return of in-person summitry. And I think this will be key for climate diplomacy throughout the rest of 2021. Cornwall will likely produce significant dividends on climate change. We've heard that already for some of our panelists, spurred largely, I think, by severe weather events that have affected each G7 country over the past year in one form or another. We've hit the hottest years on record over the last decade. So these are events that can't easily be dismissed, and they're being shared collectively by the G7. But success, I think, is also going to be spurred by a US president who is strongly committed to both multilateralism and to climate success. In fact, we know that on his very first day in the White House, Biden announced America's re-entry into the Paris Accord. So strong commitment and support by the US on climate will be key this year. And of course, the political will of Angela Merkel will also be important. She presided over the very first COP meeting 25 years ago in Berlin, and she's been an incredibly strong climate champion ever since. So I think those combined leadership styles are really going to push the climate agenda even further this year. But I'm also comforted by a number of actions that are propelling the G7 in the right direction as we head into the COP negotiations in November. First, and most significantly, the G7 will be the first at which every member has committed to hitting net zero by 2050 at the very latest, as Denisse mentioned. The UK has committed to slash 78% of its emissions by 2035, which it's expecting to become law at the end of June. So that will be formalized by the end of June. At least that's the expectation in the UK. Germany is aiming to hit net zero by 2045. So a very progressive agenda by the Germans. And the US announced on Earth Day just a few weeks ago that it plans on reducing its emissions to 2005 levels by 2030. So here we see the G7 are leading by example, and they're leading together. Secondly, Johnson is convening a number of really important climate-related meetings this year. On April 30th, he brought together a group of high-profile global business leaders, including Bill Gates and CEOs from JP Morgan Chase and Fidelity International, among others. And here, Johnson really urged these business leaders to redouble their efforts to meet net zero by 2050 and to consider innovative technology and products that can support better green job creation. On May 20th, the G7's climate environment ministers are convening virtually for 2 days. Now, as John earlier noted, these environment ministerials have typically been very strong catalysts for enhanced climate action ahead of the G7 leaders level meeting, which is happening just 3 weeks later. And just yesterday, COP President Alok Sharma arrived in Italy to meet with over 200 CEOs to share their plans on delivering on investment-led green recovery efforts. So these meetings are all, in fact, working towards a culmination of a 3-week-long virtual conference that's happening between May 31st and June 17th, where negotiations are expected to really be hammered out on key aspects of COP26. So this meeting that's happening over this period, end of May to mid-June, represents a concerted effort to really iron out all the larger issues well ahead of November, not leave them to COP, but in fact, try to get them done in advance so that the final negotiations are left to COP. Now, in addition to these high-level climate meetings, Johnson is seeking some solid commitments from his G7 partners as they head from Cornwall to Glasgow. He wants the G7 over the next 6 months to use their voices and their votes wherever possible to support the transition to net zero. This means encouraging all member countries to come to Glasgow with their 2030 reduction plans already in hand. And these individual country plans, Johnson argues, have to align with reaching net zero by 2050. So a big push for net zero, not only by the G7 and the G20, but as many participants coming to COP as possible. He's also urging his summit counterparts to do what they can to ensure that the Paris rulebook is completed at COP26. Now, the rulebook is really critical because it defines the guidelines on how climate action is implemented and how it's accounted for over the coming decades. So landing on the rulebook is going to be key. Johnson's also pushing very hard for the G7 and the G20 to make good on their previously reiterated commitment to provide $100 billion in finance per year in support of climate-related initiatives in the developing world. Now, unleashing private capital is also going to be key in securing global net zero. And what's interesting is that from the time the UK assumed its G7 presidency in January of this year, over 2,000 companies from across 84 countries have already committed to the UN's Race to Zero campaign. Now, these companies collectively account for over $13 trillion in market capital. So these types of private-public partnerships are going to be key, not just from now to COP, but also, of course, beyond. Lastly, I was particularly delighted to learn yesterday that the beloved and renowned natural historian and broadcaster, Sir David Attenborough, was named the People's Climate Advocate by the United Kingdom, which means that Attenborough is going to be addressing a number of very high-profile international climate events throughout this year, including the G7 and the G20. And he's going to really try to highlight actions that world leaders need to take on ahead of COP26 in Scotland. So what we're seeing throughout this year is that Johnson is really pulling every lever and using every opportunity to ensure successful G7 and COP meetings. And he realizes that the stakes are really high. He's urging everyone to arrive in Glasgow with their homework done. He has said this repeatedly because he says, quote, if all that emerges from COP26 is more hot air, then we have absolutely no chance of keeping our planet cool. So in the next 6 months, from Carbis Bay to Glasgow, he urges must be spent productively so that COP26 remains an opportunity to hammer out only the final details for what Johnson calls, quote, an era-defining outcome for the planet and for future generations. And on that point, I'll end and turn it back to Denisse. Thank you.
And I should have clapped for everybody, actually. Thank you, Ella, as always, so fabulously eloquent, just like all of our other speakers as well. So this basically concludes the kind of speaking part of the event, and we still have about 21 minutes or so for a Q&A. So if I could ask, please, members of the audience, if you have any burning questions, please, again, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask a question. And I just want to thank the speakers and the panelists for the incredible insights, because I am aware that I have learned a lot today. So I'm waiting for audience members to ask any questions. I'm going to also hand it over to Sonja Dobson, who is going to be leading on the Q&A. And in the absence of any audience questions, I'm sure she has something ready for our panelists. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Denisse, and also thank you to you for speaking and being a panelist and a wonderful moderator. I mean, we have quite a few participants here. Hopefully someone has a question for one of our wonderful speakers. This seems to be a no. Oh, sorry, Sir Nicholas, did you want to ask a question? Please go ahead.
Yes, please. I would like to ask a question to Ella Kokotsis. Ella, I thought your presentation was masterly, and I particularly liked it because it's a very hopeful presentation. It shows that things are on the move between now and the Glasgow COP, and that Boris Johnson is driving it. But there was one country which you didn't name in your presentation, and that is China. As I recall, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, not in the G7, of course, but in the G20. But unless there is full buy-in by China, then the COP cannot be a success. I was rather worried to read the records of what had been coming out of the G7 foreign ministers meeting, and a bit earlier, the G7 trade ministers meeting, which seemed to be rather hostile to China. The sort of thing which indeed provoked an adverse reaction from the Chinese themselves. What can you say about how you see the engagement of China being handled?
Ella, you are muted. If you could unmute, that would be great.
Somebody actually at work had cookies made that say you're on mute. And this morning during one of my work calls, she put the cookie up, and I think it's directed. She made those cookies specifically for me because I have this chronic issue of being on mute. So I apologize for that. But Sir Nicholas, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The issue of China, especially recently, as we've seen, not only on the climate front, but also, other maneuvers that are happening in the South China Sea, issues with Taiwan and Hong Kong, the Uyghurs. I mean, there's a very broad spectrum of concern as far as the Chinese are concerned. Now, I didn't touch so much on the G20. We know that, the Chinese will be obviously in attendance at the G7, at the G20 meeting, which is happening in Rome later this year, but not present at the G7 in Carnes Bay. So the extent to which the G7 can actually put pressure on the Chinese leadership ahead of the G20, I don't know to what extent they can do that effectively going into Carnes Bay and heading into COP. Now, for their part, the Chinese have made certain commitments in terms of their own reductions plans. They're hoping to become carbon neutral by 2060. So they're not looking at net zero by 2050, as all the other G7 countries have currently committed, but they are still considering carbon neutrality a decade later. So they're moving in that direction. Whether they can stay on course is obviously the big question. If they can bring nationally determined contributions to COP that show a plan of action that is concrete, that is measurable, that is definitive in some way, I think that will be very encouraging. But I don't think we're going to have any signs coming out of the G7. I think we're going to have to wait till the G20. And I think COP will ultimately determine how the Chinese plan to tackle this. But I think there's going to be a lot of pressure now that the G7 have all committed to hitting net zero by 2050 at the latest. I think that's going to only serve to add pressure on those higher, emitting countries, including not only the Chinese, but also the Russians, right? So more to come, but I think we'll have to wait to COP to see what the outcome of the Chinese initiatives will be. Thanks, Sir Nicholas.
Thanks, Ella, for that wonderful answer to that great question, Sir Nicholas. Since we have no questions at the moment from the audience, I thought we could maybe move to
Sonja,
Julia.
we have 2 more questions.
Oh.
Actually, I see Nalima?
Oh, apologies. I did not see the hand.
Apologies. And Madeline as well. Thank you.
Okay. Please, Nalima, would you like to go ahead?
Great. Thanks, Sonja, and thanks to all the panelists for an excellent session. I guess my question is related perhaps to Sonja's discussion on the development side and perhaps also Ella's. The UK has currently cut its aid budget, as you mentioned, by 0.2 ODGNI. And I'm wondering what implication does that have for Britain's soft power and its ability to bring together these allies that it is gathering around the G7 process, and is that soft power undermined by that cut? So that is the question. Thanks.
Thanks for that great question. Ella, do you want to make a remark, or should I?
As the development lead, why don't you start, and then we can continue. And I think John will have some thoughts on that as well, so we can probably tie John into the conversation. Go ahead, Sonja.
Sure. So clearly it is quite problematic as the 3rd largest donor in 2020 for the UK to lower its ODA, especially since it is in their law that they meet the 0.7% of their gross national income. But they have said that this is hopefully a 1-year thing. since 2013, they've never actually gone above 0.7%. So they're not really going above and beyond their commitments, but they were meeting their commitment, which is still quite significant. I think that as long as this is a 1-year situation, because the COVID pandemic obviously hit the UK quite hard, and they are making a lot of other commitments, and they are a strong voice in development around the world. If it continues and they do continue to shirk their duties and commitments because they are a large voice in the development community, then I think they will have a bit of a hit to their reputation. But for now, I remain optimistic.
I'll just comment that I'm encouraged by Sonja's optimism, but I will say that the 0.7% target has not only been a problem for the UK, but it's long been a problem for the G7 as well. I mean, it's a target that's rarely been hit over, the last, I don't know, 2 decades, let's say. There are very few countries inside the G7 which have actually done that. More countries outside of the G7 that have done it. The Northern Europeans particularly. So it's I call it almost, I mean, it's a soft target in the sense that it's shirked by the most important or politically significant, financially significant donors. But it's also a really hard target to hit, and it's not only a problem that the Brits face, but it's faced across the board. But I'll invite John to comment because I think he probably has some thoughts on this as well.
John, you are also muted. Yes. Denisse.
Well, thanks. From my climate change bailiwick, let me say in the first instance, it's deeply unfortunate that Mr. Johnson's government cut the United Kingdom aid budget at this time by so much. And you're quite right. This was one of the many areas where Britain in the real material world really was a number one leader. But I can't help but remember one of the most effective summits of all time, Glen Eagles 2005, where the signature themes were debt, aid, trade, and AIDS, as in HIV with tuberculosis and malaria. And one of the best things it did was not just double aid overall and Africa, commitments that were actually complied with, but they went to where the money really lies, the IMF. This is debt relief, the multilateral debt relief initiative, the MDRI. So that's what I would advise Prime Minister Johnson to do right here, right now at Cornwall, if you will, a sustainable development or green MDRI 2, specifically all of the money and instrumentalities of the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, Britain is there on the board. It controls the thing along with the Americans and a few other G7 leaders. And to say, we will give you all this money for development, specifically the United Kingdom, nor any G7 member does not need the new allocation of SDRs, right? So they could give them to the developing countries, perhaps starting with the ones who belong to the Commonwealth or La Francophonie who would do them. And if you want to do a tough love, the MDRI said you can't use the money you save from debt relief for anything, buying arms. You have to use it for health and education, I recall, good causes, but now I would say for climate change control. So there is still much good Mr. Johnson's government can do at Cornwall. So let's get together again in 4 or 5 weeks and see if he did.
Wonderful. So I wanted to mention just one more thing before we gave Nilima a chance to ask a follow-up question. Canada has recently signed a agreement with the African Development Bank for a climate fund, which would support climate and gender focused climate projects in developing countries, obviously in Africa. So if Canada brought that to the table at the G7 and the UK support a similar initiative, that could be good and helpful. Niliba, would you like to follow up on any of the comments made with your question?
Just one in particular. So climate is a signature issue for Britain. It's there front and center in its integrated review. My question, I guess, is within the context of the G7, I understand that the ODA target is a soft target. It has never been formally committed to by I think all of the G7 members, as you pointed out, Ella. So the question is there a possibility for a hard target around climate, or something to supplant the ODA target in and of itself in the context of global summitry? There is a sense in which ODA foreign aid is on a decline, both in terms of numeric, quantitative amounts, but also in terms of its legitimacy as a financial flow. And I guess the question is, can the G7, perhaps along with the G20, think about something like a more universal development commitment that embraces, global public goods like health and environment, and is climate the hook really for something that might be a more hard target for the G7?
That's a wonderful question, and maybe Brittaney would like to comment on it since she is our specialist in climate change before we go to Julia, because Julia put her hand up. Is that right? Okay, well,
if there's time for another question, I had a question also that includes Brittaney.
Okay, well, should we start with Brittaney? Would you like to answer Lima's question?
Sure, I'm not an expert on development, so I'm not sure if I can answer your question, but just in terms of targets in general, like Ella mentioned in her presentation, we saw some new targets be announced at the Earth Day Summit, new, more ambitious targets, not by every country. We also saw Indigenous youth at that summit tell the leaders that that those targets aren't enough. But possibly the G7 might make an overarching target to agree to the net zero by 2050 commitment. And since a few of the countries did make more ambitious commitments for 2030, like Ella mentioned, the UK is 68% by 2030, which I believe is actually in line with the IPCC. Maybe we'll get a 2030 commitment. But in terms of ODA and development, I don't have an answer on that one for you.
Well, on terms of ODA and development, I just want to mention that the G7 has made a couple targets. They made one, as John mentioned, at the Gleneagle Summit, and they reached it later than they intended, but they did. So with the declining ODA, ideally they will make more. But Julia, did you want to ask your question?
Marco has a question, so maybe we should
Sure. Yes, Marco, would you like to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Yes, hello. I'm Marco. I'm a student at U of T. Thank you to all the panelists for presenting. There's a lot of different perspectives and viewpoints on the subject of climate change and international relations, which was very interesting. I would like to comment on Julia Kulik's sort of a feminist perspective. I believe that's usually overlooked in terms of the role of gender. I was just doing a course on conflict, so war and conflict globally, and the issue of gender is usually overlooked, and empirically at least, it's shown that when women are given more of an opportunity to speak, so similarly to what Kulik was suggesting on climate, it's shown that progress is generally made. So thank you for presenting that perspective. It generally, it opens up for me, I guess, the perspective on also conflict and climate. So thank you for that. I don't know if you want to make any comments in response to that.
No, just say Thank you for your comment, and it's great to hear that our resources available to learn those types of things. As I noted, it is particularly important for women's voices to be heard. The International Summit, International Climate Change Negotiations, I think, as I said, we need more ambitious targets for gender equality and equal participation in these meetings. And I would also just add that we need more inclusive stakeholder participation. So it's not just women's voices that need to be heard, but as I said, in the context of climate change in Canada, Indigenous women are particularly at risk from climate change. So it's important for the people who are at risk, their voices to be heard, so that we can inform our policy making. And I guess maybe one last point, it's particularly important for us to access gender disaggregated data. Again, to make more policy and to ensure that it's evidence-based.
Wonderful. Nick, Denisse, I think I've seen a few hands. Sir Nicholas, did you have your hand up again? No. Madeline, I believe you had a question earlier. Would you like to go ahead in our last few minutes?
Sure. I don't know if anyone has an answer for my question, but the road doesn't end at Glasgow. It continues on to next year when Germany will have the chair of the G7 without Mrs. Merkel. Does anybody have any inkling of where things might go after COP26? And I throw this out to any of you.
I think that'll depend largely, Madeline, on who wins in Germany, right? And the Green Party is showing some real strength. So I don't fear the transition as much in Germany if the Green Party takes over after Angela leaves. But I absolutely agree. The absence of Angela Merkel is going to leave, I think, potentially a very, very, very big hole, possibly, depending again on leadership, because she's been such a strong advocate over the last 25 years. Even the recent meeting a couple of weeks ago on the Petersburg Climate Dialogue, which takes place traditionally outside of Bonn, this year it was virtually, was an initiative that was spearheaded by Angela Merkel a dozen years ago. She was at the first COP meeting 25 years ago in Berlin. So the absence of her, I think, will definitely play a role. I think a lot will be really predicated on who fills that. But I feel optimistic that if it is the Green Party or some coalition involving the Green Party, that it won't be as bad or as concerning.
Interesting.
John, would you like to go ahead?
Very quickly on that, Ella's right, and the German Green Party have decided to run as a candidate for chancellor, not the man, but the woman. So there'll be another woman if the polls hold up at the German hosted G7 summit next year. But when you look back on Angela Merkel when she hosted at Elmau, yes, she wasn't a member of the Green Party, but she had been an environment minister. She was a hard scientist, so got it. But there were other things that helped Elmau be relatively successful on climate change. Elmau was on the road to the big UN summit, Paris, at the end of the year. So I think we'd be more optimistic about Germany next year if we had another UN summit in December, right? Not waiting for another 5 years, which is built into the UN system. Or if the UN can't do it, let's have another one of these reinforcing summits. Macron, Biden, let's do it again. And there's other things I think we can do to make it happen. One more back to Marco. Marco, so many G7 ministers are having meetings of their own, as are the heads even more often. But there's one missing, the number twos. why don't we have the deputy heads of state or government meet? And if we did that right away, then we would get from the USA Kamala Harris, right? And from Canada, Chrystia Freeland, and one can go, but that's at least two to start, which is more than I think we'll see in the family photo, who look like females at Cornwall. So there are things that can be done right here, right now, right, to get greater gender balance into close to the top of the governance. I think the observation that you and Julia pointed to, the greater the gender balance in decision-making bodies, the better outcomes you get, not just for finance, but for climate change too.
Thanks, John. Denise, do you want to wrap it up a little, since we're a little over the time, but your comments are very welcome.
Thank you so much. I think just very quickly, I think there are things that can be done to make sure that there's some sort of continuity beyond, Glasgow into Germany. The US is having their Summit for Democracy. And I think linking the idea of climate change to corruption, I mean, it's not a tenuous link. There are so many alignments when you think about the misappropriation of and the embezzlement of ODA, right? I think there's a statistic, a World Bank statistic that said it was normally between 3 months when ODA hit a country's treasury account before it moved offshore. So kind of addressing issues like that, figuring out how to address issues, linking it to other summit themes, because climate change, as we have seen from today's panel, is linked to pretty much everything that we do in life, as well as a whole bunch of other policy issues that can be dealt with in advance. The United Nations has their UN special on corruption, special session on corruption this year as well. So again, looking at to kind of provide some sort of continuity. Also, again, environmental crime and climate change. The Germans have been leading on this as part of their FATF presidency as well. So it's something, there are ways whereby policymakers and advocacy practitioners and the private sector as well could actually, think about it in a little bit of a strategic way and figure out how you can kind of put little grains of climate change by, again, linking it into different policy issues. And I think, Brittaney, you mentioned that was, when in terms of kind of when commitments were a little bit more effective was rather than when it was being dealt with independently, when it was associated with other issues, it was compliance was a lot higher with that commitment. John, you mentioned the need to have, highly binding language, the need to have ministerial summits on these issues, partnering with the private sector as a way of, moving forward climate change initiatives. And I would expect that this is not just for G7 summits, but other summits around the world as well. Julia, you highlighted the links, and you kind of gave us a really great insight into the day-to-day impact of gender inequality and what climate change actually does to women. So again, there are more initiatives around the world that are actually looking at gender imbalances and gender equality, and again linking that climate change to gender and whatever kind of potential issue. And I mean, Sonja, climate and development, if you're looking at, again, I also work in development as well, so it's not an intenuous link, but it's such an important issue that needs to be tackled, not just climate change as a whole, but again, how it affects all of these different policy areas. And Ella, you gave us a wonderful overview and a kind of footpath towards COP26 in Glasgow. And again, what can we do beyond? So Ella, I see that you're not muted, so I feel like you have one final comment to make, but if you don't, then I would like to wrap up.
I don't, I'm good. Go ahead.
Oh, wonderful. So thank you so much for everybody who has stayed until the end. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you to the speakers and to everybody who helped organize. And for those of you who engaged and interacted with us and asked some questions, really, really appreciate having this dialogue with you. And we look forward to possibly another event post-summit. I'm not going to commit to that at the moment, but you never know. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of your day and evening or night, whatever country you're in.
Thanks,
you very
Denisse,
much.
very much for moderating.